Welcome to Centenary United Methodist Church's study, Coping as Christians. This is Lesson 2, and we're very glad that you're with us today. If you're following along in Maxie Dunnam's book, today we'll be doing Day 4, Day 5, and Day 6. A few years ago, I was out with the youth, and we were at Lake Eufaula, and I just decided I wanted to just one last time ski around the whole lake. Now, that's a big lake, and I know we wouldn't really ski around the whole lake. We'd run out of gas in the boat first, but I wanted to see just how far I could go. The youth have been skiing all day. We were just getting ready to shut down and go have dinner, and I was the last one, and I got behind the boat, and you know, the boat was packed with kids, so it wasn't pulling me up real fast, but I got up, and it was great. And I just skied and skied and skied. I love to water ski. I love the lake. I love Oklahoma in the summer. And I just was having the greatest time. I was jumping the wake, just doing all kinds of fun stuff. I don't know how long we skied. I don't know how long I was up, but it was a long time. And finally, it was just absolutely time to go to dinner. So of course, I let go of the rope and kind of slid into the water. And my friend Larry was driving the boat. It was his boat. And he came putting around back to pick me up. And I couldn't get up in the ladder. I couldn't get up the ladder of the boat. My back had just given out. I mean, I was just worn out. I was not 20 years old anymore. Suddenly I had a realization that I might not be doing that much water skiing anymore in my life. It was one of those moments when nature had a message for me, and I had to pay attention to what nature was saying to me. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the brilliant poet, puts it in a very powerful way. She wrote this masterpiece. She considered it her most mature work, called Aurora Leigh. It's an epic poem, really like a novel, and it's about a young girl who grows up. She's abused, but she overcomes it to become a poet. And in one part of that poem, she says these words: "You who keep account of crisis and transition in this life, sit down the first time nature says plain no to some yes in you, and walks over you in gorgeous sweeps of scorn. After that, we seldom doubt that something in the large, smooth order of creation has gone wrong." I just love that phrase. When nature says a plain no to some yes in you. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Understanding and how to live when nature says no to us. Right now, we're all dealing with this world health crisis and the pandemic we're experiencing, and we're getting a lot of no's in our life, driven by a part of nature that we really can't even see. That's difficult to understand. The world's greatest scientists are at work right now on the COVID-19 virus, and yet we still don't have a lot of answers. It's a powerful no. And we think about all the things that we normally do. I've had to cancel plans of my grandchildren. We've had to cancel plans of our family from New York coming to join us for Easter. Things at church, everything is on hold. There's a lot of no's in our life right now. So I'd like you to think about that phrase from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's epic poem, and think about your own life. And this will be a time you might want to write a few notes down on paper or in your notebook. Think about that phrase. When nature says plain no to some yes in you. What are the no's you're hearing from nature right now? Take a moment or two, hit pause if you'd like, and write those down, and maybe discuss them if you're watching this with someone else. Think about St. Paul. Paul had that experience too. We think of Paul as one of the greatest, maybe even the greatest Christian that ever lived. And we tend to think about those people. We call Paul St. Paul. we tend to think about those people in a very idealized kind of a way, like they were perfect. But if you read Paul, even Paul will tell you he wasn't perfect. In fact, if you'll take your Bibles and go to 2 Corinthians and go to the very end of that book, 2 Corinthians 12, verses 1 through 10, Paul talks about the struggle he had in his life. I'm going to read those words to you now. This is 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 10. I'm going to start on about verse 7 and highlight some verses. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, this is quoting what the Lord said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, I am strong. Now, those are incredibly powerful words from Paul. He recognizes that it's in our most vulnerable places where Christ is revealed in powerful ways in our life. You know, Paul also wrote, we keep this treasure in jars of clay, which was his way of saying, on the outside, we're just frail human beings. We're made of dust. But there is something inside of us spiritually that's transcendent and incredible. And when you connect that with the person of Jesus Christ, it's an incredible thing. It's a powerful thing. And even in our weakness, in our vulnerability, when we're experiencing nature's no to the yeses in us, Christ is able to manifest himself in those no's. Christ is able to become real for us in our weakness and our vulnerability and our brokenness. As a pastor, I visited hundreds of people in the hospital. I've been with probably several hundred people as they came near the end of their lives. And it's amazing to me how Christians die. They die with incredible courage, with incredible faith. Even as their body is wasting away, even as their physical life is ending, their spiritual life is blossoming and growing. It's this work that Christ does in us that is so powerful. Paul talks about having that thorn of the flesh, as we call it. And you would think that would make him less than. But he says that Christ's power has made his life perfect in weakness. It's one of those paradoxical statements that Paul is so fond of saying. He's saying that in those places where we are at our weakest and most vulnerable, we have the opportunity to see and experience Christ in a powerful way. Take a moment or two and write down in your journal, what are those places where you have a thorn in your flesh? And now let's move on. So we're going to talk about how you deal with nature's no. And a part of that answer is really difficult. It's really difficult, but it's really important to know and to get hold of. And that is that in life, there's a tragic dimension to life. There is a tragic dimension to life. There's a part of life that is just tragic. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but just coming to understand that and accept that and allow that to be a reality in your life is very, very important. When I was a young guy, and I've shared this with our congregation before, when I was a young guy, I went to college on a music scholarship. And 1 year, I was in a terrible car wreck. I was a passenger in a car, and we were hit by another car, and several people, including a child, was killed. We were hit by a drunk driver. My life just was turned into a tragedy. I lost loved ones. I lost friends. I was physically really hurt and damaged and broken. And there's just a part of life that's like that, where things happen that are almost inexplainable. And in some cases, are inexplainable. We won't know the why of it in this world. And sometimes things happen because of the decisions other people make that affect innocent lives, like the person who was drinking and driving and hit our car. Most people believe that if you do good things will happen to you. And if bad things are happening to you, it's because you've done bad things. And there are people, Jesus had to deal with people who believed that. And we still deal with people in our modern culture who believe that if you're being successful and your life is going well, it's because you've earned it. You've done enough good things to earn it. I remember a preacher in my hometown who had his initials on a gate at his house in 24 karat gold. It was his way of saying to his congregation, "See, I'm being blessed by God. I'm such a good person that God is blessing me." And Jesus dealt with that sort of attitude, and Jesus recognized that that's not the way it works. That in fact, sometimes the good suffer, and sometimes the bad grow in wealth and prosperity and in position in life. It rains on the good and on the bad alike, the just and the unjust. Methodists, we believe something that's a little different, in that we believe that God created the world good and blessed everything in the world, and that in that garden of creation, there was no pain or suffering or death. There was no competition. The lion and the lamb could lie down together. There were no predators there. And then through the introduction of sin, there came this brokenness in the world that we caused. We distorted and misshaped what God had given us. It's sort of like a great potter was working with clay and had a perfect pot shaped on the wheel, and then set us there and let us take over, and we took it and began to misshape that pot so that it no longer would even function the way it was created to function. Out of that brokenness, out of that sin, John Wesley said that all, quoting Paul, said that all of creation is groaning for the day when God will make things right again. And we believe that day will come. But we're living in that in-between time when there's sickness and there's death and there are viruses and pandemics that come out of living in a broken world. Leslie Weatherhead was a wonderful Methodist minister in England, and he was a pastor in England during World War II. He was serving at a church that was very near the coast, and during World War II, the Germans were coming over and they were bombing British cities and villages. And Leslie was a pastor, and he was preaching to his congregation there. And one Friday night, there was a wedding in his church, and a young RAF pilot and a beautiful young girl who had grown up in Leslie's Methodist church there, they were married. And because the war was so desperate, they only had a couple of days together, and then the pilot was back in the air again, and he was a part of the Royal Air Force, and he was fighting the Luftwaffe over the skies of England, and he was killed. He was killed. And the next Sunday, the young bride and her family were there in church, and people were going up to her saying, "Well, this is God's will. This is God's way of teaching you something. This is God's way of trying to get your attention." And Leslie Weatherhead was so repulsed by that he sat down and he wrote this powerful book called The Will of God. And I've been in Pentecostal pastor's office, they'll have it. I've been in a Catholic priest's office, they'll have a copy of this book. I mean, people have throughout Christendom, of every denomination, read Weatherhead's book on the will of God. And Weatherhead explains it this way. He says that first, God has an intentional will for our life. And that intentional will is what God wants for us. Weatherhead, of course, was a Methodist, so he's thinking of that original creation of God that was perfect and beautiful and without pain or suffering or tears or death. And then there's that brokenness that comes about because of sin and the choices that I make and the choices you make and the choices that other people make and the way those choices collide, especially when we're selfish or thinking only of ourselves. But Weatherhead says that God is still at work even then. He talks about God's circumstantial will. Even in the circumstances that we create, God is at work. We may take that first drink and become an alcoholic. And sometimes we'll say to God, why did you let me do that? Well, in fact, we made that choice. We decided to take that drink. We caused those circumstances that bring about heartache. But Weatherhead said, even in the midst of that, God is still at work. And somebody will come to you and invite you to go to an AA meeting and befriend you and help you to turn your life around. That's the circumstantial will of God. And then Weatherhead, thinking about that thing Methodists think about, we call heaven, talked about the ultimate will of God. That God ultimately, his will not be defeated or thwarted. That God's ultimate will is to offer redemption to all of creation. And that's witnessed to in the life, the cross, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that God's kingdom in Jesus Christ will come again. And once more, we live in that period in between. And we live in a period where sometimes nature will say no to us. But even in the midst of that, God is active in our lives and claiming us. So I invite you to take a moment and remember Paul's word that he talked about that thorn he had in his flesh. And he said, but we do not lose heart. That's that trusting that even in the midst of the circumstances that we've created with our choices, that other people create with their choices that bring heartache into the world and suffering into the world, even in the midst of that, we don't lose heart because we know that God is active and is pouring out his love through Jesus Christ into our life, giving us the opportunity and the opening doors for us time and again to change our life and to make our lives new, working through the circumstances that we've created and others have created to draw us closer and closer to his kingdom. So I'd like you to take a moment, think about maybe writing down a couple of things or sharing with others that you're talking to. What situations do you face that challenge you to lose heart? What are those places in your life right now where you feel like you're losing heart? Take a moment and reflect on that and write that down if you would. And now, as you look at those things that you've written down and that are maybe causing you to lose heart, does your perspective change on them as you think about what Weatherhead said? That even in the midst of these circumstances, even when nature is saying no to the yes in us, that God is still at work in our life, and that God's ultimate will is to open a door in our life that will lead us closer and closer to his kingdom. How does that affect, thinking about that, how does that affect those things that are causing you to lose heart? The Apostle Paul said, our outer nature is wasting away, but our inner nature is being renewed every day. That's such a powerful statement. Our outer nature is wasting away, but our inner nature is being renewed every day. That comes from the same passage in 2 Corinthians 12. And he's saying that, we are flesh and blood, and we are human beings. We are vulnerable. We're not infinite like God. We're transient like God. We're transient like human beings. Our flesh doesn't last forever. In our flesh, we age, and we experience things physically that change in our lives, and sometimes we come across things like this pandemic that really cause challenges for us, may even make us ill. But even though that outer part of us is wasting away, the apostle says, we're being renewed spiritually, and we can count on that. My wife Prudy and I were blessed to lead a mission group a couple of years ago to the Methodist Hospital in Maua, Kenya. And I encourage you to be in prayer for the people in the Maua, Kenya Methodist Hospital right now, because they're facing this whole pandemic in a region with 1 million people who use one tiny hospital. Doesn't have heat and air, has intermittent electricity. They don't have the proper equipment to protect the staff, and they're going to be caring for coronavirus victims there. We were there, and we would visit in the wards, and my wife and I particularly would visit in a ward with people who were dying. And I can remember being with one lady, and she knew that her life was coming to an end. And she gave a powerful testimony. She just sat up on her bed and began to testify to the other patients there that she knew soon she would be laying down her body, but that Christ would give her a new body, and that her new spiritual body would never know pain, would never know tears or suffering, and that she would be filled with joy and life forever and ever. God claims us in the midst of tragedy. God seeks us out. God pursues us. That really is the story of the Bible. If you read the Bible from page 1 to the last page, what you have is a story of God pursuing us, seeking us out, longing to love us. Now, to really experience God in the midst of tragedy, I think there are two things that are just vital for us. And I want you to write these down in your journal. I think these are really important right now in the midst of this pandemic for us to experience God. The first thing is this: we have to resist self-pity. That's the easiest thing in the world, to look at our situation and think about the hardships we're going through. And some people are going through absolutely real hardships. We have folks that are widows and widowers, and they're home alone by themselves. We have folks that are dealing with illness. We have people who are working in the medical field or have family members they're worried about in the medical field. We have folks who because of their own health, they're very vulnerable and at risk to this virus. So there's a lot of real hurt, fear, and anxiety out there. And yet at the same time, we have to resist feeling self-pity. That just leads us down a path that's just only goes to a dark place and doesn't help anything. So what we have to, I think, focus on, and this really is the second point I want to encourage you to write down in your journal. We have to visualize a new possibility. Resist self-pity and begin to visualize a new possibility. What can I do with my life right now? What is God doing with my life right now? You know, I think lots of times we want things to be different. We really want things to be different, but we don't expect things to be different. There's a huge difference between wanting and expecting. When you want things to be different, you just sit there and wish things would change. But when you expect things to change, you start to do things to prepare yourself. You start to shape your life in a certain direction. I think this is time to visualize new possibilities in our life and begin to expect God to do something powerful and wonderful with our life. When I had my car accident that I was talking about, I was going to school on a music scholarship, and the accident was so bad I knew I'd never be a professional musician because of the injuries. And I went through a time of real depression about that. That did seem to be the only thing in life I was interested in. And people began to visit me from the Methodist student group on campus, the Wesley Foundation, they're called now, and other college students. And I began over a period of time to realize that God hadn't caused that accident. That was a person's decision to drink and drive, not God. But in the midst of those circumstances, in the midst of that tragedy, when nature was saying no to me because of injuries I had, that God was opening a new door in my life. I didn't know exactly where that was leading at the time. At first I became a social worker, then a family counselor, and then a youth director, and then a director of Christian education. And finally, I said yes to God and became a pastor. I put it off. I tried to do other things first, but I became a pastor. And God worked through that tragedy to reshape my life. And when I began to expect God to do something great and wonderful with my life, I started to do things differently. I read different books than I'd ever read before. I associated with a different group of people than I had associated with before. I wasn't completely sure where God was taking my life, but I knew it was time for me to start preparing for that next life. So I'd like to conclude today by just asking you this. Now think about nature's no. Where nature is saying no to the yes in your life. What would change if you expected God to do something powerful with your life right now? What would change for you if you expected God to do something powerful with your life? I look forward to seeing you for Lesson 3. Thank you once again for being a part of this study. Please share it and invite others to participate. Thank you.